I have watched a lot of cars leave that gate. 3 years I worked at the palace on and off, and most of that time I was close enough to the road to hear the tires turn on the cobbles. You stop noticing it after a while. The big black cars come, they idle, they leave. A hand lifts behind tinted glass. The crowd makes that soft sound a crowd makes, half a cheer, half a sigh, and then everyone goes back to their phones. Only once did I see a guard step in front of one of those cars. I still think about it. Not every day, but more often than you'd expect. I'll be doing something ordinary, washing a cup, waiting for a kettle, and it comes back to me. The sound the engine made when it stopped too fast. The way the whole street went quiet at the same moment, like somebody had turned the volume down on the world. I want to tell it properly from the start because people who weren't there always get it wrong. They say the Queen was cruel. They say the guard was a hero. They say a lot of things and most of it is too simple. The truth was messier and softer, and it took me a long time to understand any of it. So let me take you back. If you've never been, the palace I'm talking about is Wexhill. It sits at the top of the old city in the Kingdom of Havern, behind a long iron fence with gold tips that the tourists always photograph and never look at properly. It's not the prettiest palace in the world. It's gray and square and a bit stern, honestly, like a headmaster who used to be kind once. But people come from everywhere to stand at that fence. Coaches, families, old couples holding paper maps even now, even with everyone holding a screen. I worked in visitor services, which is a fancy way of saying I stood near the side gate in a uniform and answered questions. Where's the toilet? What time is the guard change? Is the Queen home? I was never allowed to answer that last one, even when I knew, especially when I knew. I want you to picture the morning, because the morning matters. It was the back end of winter, that horrible in-between time when the calendar says spring but the air hasn't been told. The sky was that thin, scrubbed blue you only get when it's properly cold. No clouds, just a sharp pale light that made everything look very clean and a little bit unreal. Frost still sitting on the shaded side of the railings at 8 in the morning. You could see your breath. The pigeons looked annoyed. I remember the cold because of my hands. I'd forgotten my gloves and I kept tucking my fingers under my arms when no one was looking. There's a photograph somewhere from that day, a tourist's photo that ended up everywhere later, and if you look at the edge of it you can just see me, a small blurry figure in a gray coat with my hands jammed up like a scarecrow. People have asked me about it. I always say, that's just me being cold. It's not very dramatic. The crowd was bigger than usual. That was the first thing. Normally a weekday morning that early, you get maybe 40 people at the fence, a thin scatter of them, mostly serious photographers with the long lenses and the patience of saints. But that morning there were hundreds. They were packed 3 and 4 deep along the front railings, and more were arriving, and the police had put up the little metal barriers that they only bother with when they're expecting something. There was a reason. The whole country knew the reason. It was a day of mourning. I'm being careful with the details here because I don't want to point at anything real, so I'll just tell you what we all understood at the time. Some weeks before, there had been a terrible thing. An accident far away from the capital that had taken the lives of a number of young people from one of the kingdom's towns. It was the sort of news that stops a country for a few days. Flowers appeared at gates that had nothing to do with the families. Strangers cried on trains. You know how it goes. Grief looks for somewhere to put itself, and a lot of it ended up at our fence, in cellophane and handwritten cards and small soft toys that the rain ruined within a day. That morning, the royal family was due to attend a memorial service at the cathedral across the city. The big one, the old gray one with the bells you can hear from the river. The service was going to be broadcast. Half the country would be watching, and so the cars were coming. When there's an event like that, the palace forecourt turns into a kind of slow, careful machine. I'd seen it 100 times by then, but it still got under my skin a little, the seriousness of it. From maybe 7 o'clock, the cars start being moved into position. Not just the cars you see, the polished ones, but the others too, the plainer ones, the ones full of people whose whole job is to make sure nothing ever goes wrong. Men with earpieces walking the line of the fence very slowly, looking at nothing and seeing everything. A van that arrives and parks and never opens its doors. And the guards. You have to understand about the guards, because this whole story is about one of them. And if you don't understand them first, then nothing he did will make sense. They are not what you think. People look at them and see the costume, the dark coats, the tall hats, the stillness. Tourists treat them like statues, which is unkind, although I understand why, because the men do everything in their power to be statues. They don't speak. They don't look at you. They don't react. There's a whole game the tourists play, trying to make them flinch. And I've watched grown adults pull faces and wave their hands and shout. And the guard just stares through them at a point 1,000 miles away, like the tourist is a small weather event that will pass. But they're soldiers. That's the thing people forget. Real ones. The stillness isn't decoration, it's discipline, and discipline that deep doesn't come cheap. Every single one of them has been somewhere and done something to earn that post. The man standing like a toy outside the gate has, more likely than not, been in places you couldn't sleep after seeing once. I knew a few of them to nod at. Not well. You don't really chat with them, not on duty, but over years you learn faces, you learn the small human things underneath. One of them collected stamps, which always made me laugh, this enormous serious man with a hobby like a vicar. One of them had a wife who was expecting, and you could see it on him near the end, that careful tiredness. And then there was the one this story is about. His name, I'll call him Tomas, because that's close enough and the rest isn't mine to give away, was, I think, the stillest of all of them. That's saying something. The other guards were still the way a held breath is still. Tomas was still the way a stone in a river is still. There was something completely settled about him. He had a long, plain, serious face, the kind that looks like it's thinking even when it's resting, and pale eyes that didn't move, and I never once saw him so much as twitch at the tourists. They'd given up on him mostly. Word got around even among the visitors. That one won't crack. I'd worked out from listening to the other staff that he was older than he looked, that he'd served a long time before this posting, and that he'd asked specifically to be here. Most of the young ones see the gate as a chore between better things. Tomas, somebody told me, had wanted it, had earned the right to a quieter posting somewhere else and turned it down to stand at that fence in the cold. Nobody quite knew why. I used to wonder about him. There's a kind of stillness that's empty and a kind that's full, and his was the second kind. You got the feeling he was holding something. I never knew what. Not then. That morning he was at the post nearest the main gate, the one the cars pass closest to as they pull out. I noticed him because I always noticed him, the way you notice a landmark you've decided to like. He looked exactly as he always looked. Coat brushed, boots black enough to shave in, eyes forward, cold morning sun on the side of his face. He had no idea, and neither did I, that within the hour everybody in the country would know his name. The cars came up from the courtyard around 9:30. You could feel the crowd change when they appeared. There's a current that runs through a lot of people standing close together, and it shifted, everyone leaning the same way at once, phones going up like a field of strange flowers turning to the sun. The cars rolled into their line on the forecourt, 3 of them gleaming, and stopped, engines running, breathing little ghosts of exhaust into the cold. I want to slow down here, because the next part is where it all turned, and people remember it wrong. The plan, as far as a person in my job ever knows the plan, was simple. The Queen would travel in the first car. The younger members of the family would follow. There's an order to these things, fixed and old, and on a normal day it runs like clockwork because everyone has done it 1,000 times and nobody has to think. But this wasn't a normal day, and you could tell, because the clockwork was wrong. The first thing that was wrong was the timing. They were late. Not by much, a few minutes, but for that machine a few minutes is an earthquake. I saw two of the equerries, the men in mourning coats who organize everything and never raise their voices, talking too fast near the steps, and one of them kept looking at his watch, and the other kept looking at the palace doors, and neither of them looked happy. The second thing that was wrong was the queen. I should tell you about her now, because she's the one everybody hates after this, and I don't think that's fair even today. I'll call her the queen plain because again, none of this is meant to be a real person, but I'll tell you how she was. She was older. Not frail, never frail, but you could see the years on her that morning in a way you usually couldn't. She was a woman who'd spent 50 years being looked at, and she'd learned to give the cameras a face that didn't tell them anything, a pleasant, closed, weatherproof face. The public found her cold. They always had. She wasn't the one they'd chosen to love. That morning, even from where I stood, the face was wrong. The weatherproofing had cracked. She came out of the palace doors fast, faster than her usual measured pace, and she wasn't looking at the crowd at all, which she always did, always a small wave, a fixed smile. Not this time. She came down the steps with her head slightly bent and her mouth set in a hard line, and she got into the first car without pausing, and the door shut, and I thought something's happened. You learn to read these mornings, and this one read like fear. I didn't know what about. None of us did, not yet. But there was a wrongness coming off that forecourt like cold off a lake, and the equerries felt it, and the men with the earpieces felt it, because I watched them go from their slow, careful walk to something faster and tighter. Three of them suddenly closed together by the second car, heads down, talking. And then there was the princess. Now, the princess. Her I have to be honest about because she's the one this whole thing turns on, and she's also the one the country had decided to adore, and adoration makes people stupid about a person. They didn't see her clearly. They saw what they wanted. I'll call her the princess, the young one, the one married in. She wasn't born to it. She'd come into the family from outside, an ordinary enough background by royal standards, and the country had fallen for her completely and at once, the way you do for someone who seems too good and too kind to actually exist. She was lovely to look at, of course, they always are in the photographs, but it was more than that. There was something genuinely warm about her. I'd seen it up close a handful of times. She remembered names. She crouched down to talk to children at their level instead of looming over them. Once, on a wet day, I watched her stop and properly listen to an old man at the fence who'd waited 4 hours to give her a letter about his late wife, and she didn't do the polite 30 seconds and move on. She stood there in the rain and let him finish. And when he cried, she put her hand on his arm, and I promise you there was nothing performed about it. I was close enough to see her own eyes go wet. So the love made sense, but love like that is heavy. It's a lot to carry. And that winter she'd been carrying it badly. There'd been talk. There's always talk, but this had a different weight to it. She'd missed engagements. She'd looked thin and pale in the few photographs that did appear. The polite story was that she'd been unwell, and maybe that was true, but the staff who saw her up close had a sense of something heavier than a virus, a flatness, a person going through the motions of being herself. Grief, maybe, although nobody knew the cause, exhaustion. The slow crushing of being looked at by millions of people who have decided you're perfect, when you wake up every morning knowing you're not. That memorial morning was, I think, the first big public thing she'd done in weeks, and everyone knew it, the crowd knew it. Half of them were there for her, hopping to see her, willing her to be all right. The cards at the fence weren't all for the dead. A lot of them were for her. Get well, thinking of you, we love you, ma'am. I'd read a few. They broke my heart a little, those cards, because the people writing them thought they were sending love to a fairy tale, and I'd seen the actual tired young woman it was meant to reach. She came out of the palace doors maybe a minute after the queen. And here's where it starts. She came out slowly. That was the first thing I noticed, the difference in their two walks, the queen fast and bent and the princess slow and pale. The princess paused at the top of the steps in the cold, bright light, and for a second she just stood there, the way you stand when you've forgotten whether you've turned the oven off. Lost, a little. The crowd saw her and made it sound, that rising warm noise, and she lifted her head and gave them a smile. And even from where I was, I could see the smile was the kind you build out of nothing, brick by brick, because the people need it. She lifted a hand. The crowd loved it, phones everywhere. And then she turned and said something to a member of staff at the door, and went back inside. I remember thinking nothing of it. People go back in. You forget a glove, a phone, a note for the day. It happens. I'd have done the same. The cars were still there, 3 of them idling on the cobbles, doors waiting. She'd be 30 seconds. But the machine was already broken, and I didn't know it. Because down in the first car, behind the dark glass, the Queen was sitting with whatever fear had chased her out of the building, and an equerry was leaning in at her window with his face very serious. And somewhere in the next few seconds, a decision was made that none of us on the outside could see being made. I only know the shape of it now, after years of hearing the pieces. At the time, all I saw was the result. The lead equerry straightened up from the Queen's window. He turned to the driver of the first car, and he said something. I couldn't hear it. Nobody at the fence could hear it. But I watched it travel, the way you can sometimes watch a word travel through people, equerry to driver, driver going still, the slow turn of a head toward the palace doors where the princess had just gone in. And then the brake lights of the first car went off. I want you to understand how strange that was. Those cars do not move until everyone is in them. That is the entire point. They wait. They always wait. It is the most fixed thing about the whole ritual. The cars wait for the family. The first car's lights went off, and the engine note changed, that small deepening you feel more than hear, and the great black car began, very slowly, to roll forward toward the gate. Without her, the princess was still inside the palace, and the car was leaving. I think a part of my brain refused it at first. I genuinely stood there and thought, no, I've misread it. They're just adjusting position. They do that. They shuffle the cars forward sometimes to line them up with the gate. But it kept going. Slow and smooth and certain, the way those cars do everything, rolling toward the open gate, toward the road, toward the cathedral on the other side of the city, where in less than an hour the bells would ring, and the cameras would be waiting, and the whole country would be watching for the family to arrive. And the family, the young one, the loved one, the one the cards were for, was standing somewhere behind a closed palace door, about to come back out into the cold and find an empty space where her car should have been. The crowd hadn't caught it yet. That's a thing about crowds, they're a beat behind. They were still smiling at the doors, waiting for the princess to come back, phones still up. They hadn't understood that the lead car was moving and that this was wrong. But the guards understood. I know they did because I was looking right at Tomas, the still one, the stone in the river, and I watched the stillness break. It was the smallest thing first. His eyes moved, just his eyes. After 3 years of never once seeing them move, I saw them flick to the rolling car, to the palace doors, back to the car, and his jaw tightened. A muscle stood out on the side of his long, plain face. And then the palace doors opened, and the princess came out, and she was alone. She came out the way you'd come out of your own front door expecting a taxi, that small forward lean. The readiness, and then she saw it. I watched her see it. I watched the moment her eyes found the line of cars and counted them and understood that the first one, hers, the one she was meant to be in, the one with the Queen, was already at the gate, already half into the road, leaving. She stopped at the top of the steps. And her face, God, her face. I'll never forget her face. It wasn't anger. I think anger would have been easier to watch. It was the face of a child who has turned around in a busy place and found that the hand she was holding is gone. Pure, naked, undefended. For 1 second the whole built-up smile, the whole public mask, just fell off her. And underneath it was a young woman who had been left, in front of hundreds of people and a country full of cameras, by the family she'd married into and tried so hard to be good enough for. She didn't move. She couldn't. She just stood there at the top of the steps, very pale, very still, while her car drove away from her. And the crowd finally caught up. You could hear it happen. The warm noise curdled. It went from awe to something else, a confused, rising murmur, hundreds of people realizing at once that they were watching something they shouldn't be. Somebody near me said out loud, "What's she doing? Why are they leaving her?" A child somewhere started crying, the way children do when the adults around them go tense. The lead car was almost in the road now. A few more feet and it would be gone, past the gate, swallowed by the city, and the moment would be locked, the princess abandoned on the steps for everyone to see, a thing that could never be unseen or unsaid. A few more feet. And that is when Tomas moved. I have tried many times to describe how fast it happened and how slow it felt both at once. I've never got it right. Time does something strange in a moment like that. It stretches and it snaps. I'll do my best. The car was almost in the road. The princess was frozen at the top of the steps. The crowd's sound had gone from warm to wrong. And Tomas, who had not moved a single muscle in the 3 years I'd been watching him, took one step off his post. Just one at first. A single pace forward off the little raised stone where the guards stand. And even that, you have to understand, even that was extraordinary. They don't leave the post. The post is the whole thing. There are men whose entire careers are measured by the fact that they did not leave the post when a tourist screamed in their face or fainted at their feet or, once I heard, set off a firework. They stay. That is the deal. That is the discipline that the whole gray, beautiful ritual is built on top of. He left it. And then the 1 step became 3, and the 3 became a run. I'd never seen one of them run. I didn't know they could in those coats, in those boots. He moved low and fast, the way a soldier moves, not the way you or I would, and he crossed the cobbles between his post and the gate in a handful of strides, his coat snapping out behind him, and I remember thinking, with a stupid clear calm, he's going to be too late. He wasn't. He got to the gateway maybe half a second before the car did, and he stopped, and he turned, and he planted himself in the middle of the open gate, square on, facing the car, his feet apart and his back straight, and his arms, this is the part I'll never get out of my head, his arms slightly out from his sides, palms a little forward, not raised over his head, not waving, just open, the posture of a man saying no with his whole body, the posture of a wall that has decided to be a wall. And the car came at him. It wasn't fast. I keep having to remind people of that because they imagine it like a film, the screech and the smoke. It wasn't like that. The car was barely above walking pace, but it was 3 tons of armored metal and it was moving and he was a man in a coat, and for one horrible held breath it did not look like it was going to stop. I heard the crowd scream. Not all of them. Some of them. A few hundred people make a strange, ragged sound when they all gasp at slightly different times. Somebody grabbed my arm, a stranger, a woman next to me at the fence. She just grabbed me and held on, and I held her back, and neither of us knew we were doing it. The driver saw him. Of course he saw him, and the brakes came on. That was the sound I told you about, the one that comes back to me washing a cup. The tires on the cold cobbles, that short, hard bark of rubber, the nose of the car dipping as it stopped. It stopped close, closer than it should have. The front of it came to rest maybe an arm's length from Tomas's knees. If he'd had a long stride left in him, he could have touched the bonnet. He didn't move. That's the thing. He'd done the impossible thing, the thing that would end his career, the thing none of them ever do, and then, having done it, he just stood there, still again, as if he'd never run at all. As if standing in front of the Queen's car was simply the new place he was meant to stand, and he intended to stand there with exactly the same stone-in-a-river stillness he'd given the gate for 3 years. And then nobody knew what to do. That's the part nobody films right because there's nothing to film. There was just a long, awful, suspended nothing. The car stopped in the gateway, the man in front of it. The crowd, silent now, completely silent, hundreds of people not making a sound. The princess on the steps with her hand half raised, her mouth open. The equerries froze in mid-stride. The men with the earpieces with their hands going to their collars but not yet moving, because not one of them had a procedure for this. There is no procedure for this. The rule book has a page for everything except a guard stepping in front of the queen. I could hear in all that silence a single thing, a flag, the big flag on the palace roof snapping in the cold wind. Crack, crack. That's all there was for a second. A man, a car, and a flag. I want to stop the story here for a moment, because this is where it would be easy to make him a hero, and I think if I make him a hero too fast I'll lie to you. People say it like it's simple. He stood up for her. He couldn't stand by and watch her be humiliated, so he did the brave thing. And maybe that's true. I think a version of it is true. But I've thought about that man for years now, and I don't think bravery is quite the word, or not the whole word. I think he was holding something. I told you that in the beginning. The full kind of stillness, not the empty kind. And I think whatever he was holding, it had a shape, and the shape of it was somebody being left behind. I'll come to how I know that, but hold it in your mind. When you picture him standing in front of that car, don't picture a hero who decided to be brave. Picture a man who saw a particular thing happen, a person, alone, on some steps, being driven away from, and felt something old and buried in him sit up and refuse. I don't think he decided anything. I think his body decided before he did. I think the discipline that had held him still for so long was, underneath, made of the exact thing that made him run. They were the same thing. He'd been standing still all those years for the same reason he couldn't stand still now. But I'm getting ahead. Back to the gate, back to the silence and the flag. The driver's window came down. I couldn't see into the first car from where I was. The angle was wrong and the glass was dark, but I could see the driver's window go down a few inches, and I could see the driver, a man I half knew by sight, a calm, gray-haired man who'd driven that car for years, saying something out through the gap, saying it to Tomas. His face was not angry. That surprised me at the time, though it doesn't now. He looked more than anything frightened, asking a question, I think. "What are you doing? Move, please move." Tomas didn't answer. Of course he didn't. He doesn't speak on duty, and I don't think it would have occurred to him that the rules about speaking had stopped applying just because every other rule had. He just stood, arms a little open, and looked at the driver and did not move. And then the back window of the car came down. The crowd made a sound at that, a low one, because behind that window was the Queen. I've never been able to decide what I'd have done in her place, and I've had years to decide. Try to imagine it. You are the most photographed woman in the kingdom. You are sitting in a stopped car in front of hundreds of people and 100 cameras, on the morning of a national day of mourning, and one of your own guards has just thrown his career, and possibly his liberty under your wheels to stop you leaving without your daughter-in-law. Every instinct you have ever trained says, do not let them see anything. The weatherproof face, the closed, pleasant nothing. She didn't do that. I'll give her that forever. She didn't hide. The window came down and her face came into the cold light, and it was, I keep coming back to this word, it was afraid. The same fear I'd seen on her coming out of the doors, but worse now, naked now, because the moment had ripped the mask clean off her too. She looked at Tomas standing in front of her car, and then she turned her head fast and looked back over her shoulder, through the rear glass at the steps. At the princess. And the two of them looked at each other. The old queen in the stopped car and the young princess at the top of the steps. Across maybe 40 feet of cobbles and one frozen guard. The whole country, it turned out later, watching, because of course the cameras had it, of course they did, the cameras have everything. And whatever was in that look, I was too far to read it, and even if I'd been close, I'm not sure I'd have understood it then. Whatever was in it, something broke open. The Queen's mouth moved. She said something, sharp and short, to the driver, to the equerry, I couldn't tell, and the door of the first car opened. She got out. A queen getting out of a stopped car in the middle of a gateway does not sound like much when I write it down, but I promise you the crowd reacted to it like a clap of thunder. The murmur surged. Phones, which had dipped in the shock, came back up. People were standing on tiptoe, climbing the lower rail of the fence, and the police weren't even stopping them because the police were watching too. She got out and she was small. That always struck people who saw her up close, how small she was, this woman who took up so much room in the country's imagination. She came around the open door of the car, and she stood for a second beside it, beside the guard, beside Tomas, who still had not moved, and she looked at him. And I will tell you the thing that, more than the running, more than the car, more than any of it, is the part of that morning I carry. She didn't shout at him. Everyone expected her to. You could feel the crowd brace for it. A queen humiliated in public. Surely now comes the fury, the cold royal rage. The guard marched away. That's the story the crowd had already half written in its head. The cruel old queen, the brave guard, the punishment. She didn't. She looked at him for a long moment, and something passed over her face that I've never had a good word for. Not anger. Closer to recognition, maybe. The look of someone who has just been shown something true that they did not want to see and cannot now unsee, and is too honest deep down to pretend they didn't. She looked at this man who had defied her, defied everything to stop her car. And I swear to you she gave him the smallest nod. Just a fraction. A movement you'd miss if you blinked. An acknowledgement. And then she turned away from him and away from the car, and she walked quickly in those small fast steps back across the cobbles, toward the steps, toward the princess. Here's where I have to be careful because I genuinely don't know everything that was said. I was at the fence. I was close enough to see, not close enough to hear. So I'll tell you what I saw, and where I'm guessing, I'll say I'm guessing. The queen crossed the forecourt. The princess came down a few steps to meet her, halfway, and they stopped, the two of them close together in front of everyone. For a moment they just stood, and then the queen reached out and took the younger woman's hands, both of them, in both of hers. And she said something, I'm guessing, but I'm fairly sure she said something low and fast and urgent, her head bent close to the princess's, and the princess listened, and the princess's face, which had been that frozen, abandoned, child-in-a-crowd face, began to change. I couldn't hear the words. I've heard a dozen versions since of what they were, and I don't believe most of them because most of them are too neat, and life isn't neat and grief isn't neat. But I watched the change come over the princess's face as the queen spoke, and it was the change of someone going from "you left me" to "oh, that's not what happened in real time." The slow dawning, the eyes filling. And then the princess's hand came up and covered her own mouth, and her shoulders dropped, and you could see the whole rigid, terrible brace thing in her just let go. The queen put her arm around her, around the younger woman's shoulders, and drew her in, and held her there for a moment in front of the whole watching country, the two of them, the old one and the young one, on the steps where a minute before one of them had been left behind. And the crowd, I'll never forget this, the crowd, which had been so silent, made a sound I have never heard a crowd make before or since. It wasn't a cheer. It was softer and stranger than a cheer. It was the sound a few hundred people make when they have all started quietly to cry. Now Tomas. While all this was happening on the steps, the machine had started to move again behind him, the way it does, the way it always does once the worst of a thing is over. The men with the earpieces had unfrozen. Two of them had come up either side of him, close, the way you stand next to a man you're not yet sure about. The equerry was hurrying over with his morning coat tails flying, his calm completely gone. And Tomas, the car had switched off its engine now, the threat of it gone. Tomas had finally moved. He'd stepped back out of the gateway, square paces, controlled, the way they're trained. He'd put himself back near his post, more or less, and he'd come back to attention, eyes forward, hands at his sides, the stone in the river again, as though if he just stood still enough the last 90 seconds might agree not to have happened. It wouldn't, of course. You don't undo a thing like that. I watched the equerry reach him and speak to him, low and hard, right up close to his face, the way I'd spoken to no one in the palace and hoped never to be spoken to. I couldn't hear it. I didn't need to. You know the shape of what in God's name do you think you were doing even from 40 feet away? And the two men with the earpieces stood a little closer. And Tomas took it, eyes forward, not a flicker, not a word in his own defense. He stood and let it come and gave nothing back, and I understood, watching him, that he had known, the whole time. He'd known exactly what stepping off that post would cost him, known it before his feet ever moved, and he'd done it anyway, and now he was going to stand here and pay for it without complaint, because that was also the discipline, that was the same thing, the staying still under the running under the staying still. They led him away after a few minutes. Not roughly. I want to be fair to everyone in this, because everyone in it was just a person trying to do an impossible job on an awful morning. They didn't drag him. The two men walked him, one on each side, back across the forecourt and in through a side door of the palace, and he went upright, eyes ahead, his tall hat catching the cold sun, and the crowd, who by now had worked out who he was and roughly what he'd done, started to clap. It rolled along the fence, the clapping, started near the gate and spread. By the time he reached the door, it was the whole crowd, hundreds of people, applauding a guard being walked off his post in disgrace, and he didn't acknowledge it, didn't turn, didn't slow, just went in through the door with the two men, and the door closed behind him. And that was the last any of us at the fence saw of him that day. I stood there with my cold hands jammed under my arms and a complete stranger's grip still on my sleeve, and I thought, I don't even know your name. I would by that evening, so would everyone. The cars left a few minutes later, properly this time, all of them. The Queen and the Princess in the first one together, side by side behind the dark glass, gone to the cathedral where the bells were already starting up, low and slow across the cold city. The crowd began to break up and reform the way crowds do, everybody suddenly talking, everybody turning to the person next to them needing to say, "Did you see that? Did you see that?" The woman who'd grabbed my arm let go of me at last, and we looked at each other, two strangers, and she said, "What just happened?" And I said honestly, "I don't know." And I didn't, not the half of it, not yet. Because here's the thing I didn't understand, standing there at the fence in the thin spring light. I thought I'd watched a guard save a young woman from being humiliated, a brave man and a cruel order and a public rescue. That was the story, that was what it looked like, that's what the whole country decided it was by lunchtime. It wasn't that. It was something much harder and much sadder, and in the end much kinder. And the reason the Queen got out of that car instead of having him thrown in a cell, the reason she nodded at him, the reason she ran to the steps, the reason the princess's face did what it did, was a thing none of us at the fence could have guessed. To understand it, I have to tell you why the order was given in the first place. And I have to tell you what Tomas had buried, and why a man stands still at a gate for 3 years in the cold when he's earned the right to be somewhere warmer. Both of those things came out later, some of it in the days that followed, some of it only after a long time, and one piece of it I learned myself, by accident, months on, in a corridor from a man who didn't know I was listening. Let me tell you all of it. By that evening the whole country knew. I went home on the late tram with my hands finally warm and my head full of it, and the man across the aisle from me was watching it on his phone, the clip, and the woman beside him was watching it on hers, and at the next stop 3 people got on already talking about it. You could feel it moving through the city like weather. By the time I was through my own front door, it was the only thing on the news. The clip, the guard, the car. Played and replayed, slowed down, frozen on the frame where he steps into the gateway with his arms a little open. They'd found out his name by then. The papers had it. I won't give you the real one, I've told you I'll call him Tomas, but I'll tell you the headline mood, which was adoration. Overnight, the brave guard, the man who said no to a queen. By morning there were flowers at the gate for him, can you believe that, propped against the railings near his post, and cards, and one enormous hand-painted banner that somebody had stayed up all night to make, that just said thank you in letters a foot high. And underneath the adoration, like a dark thread, ran the other story. The cruel queen. The cold old woman who tried to drive away and leave the people's darling alone on the steps. That one moved just as fast. Faster, maybe, because anger always travels faster than the truth. And the truth, as usual, was nobody's idea of a good headline. It was just true. Let me tell it to you the way it came out, piece by piece, over the days and weeks that followed, because that's how I got it, and I think that's the honest way to give it to you. The order. Why the order was ever given. That came out first, and quietly, the way the real explanations always do, not on the front pages, but in the careful gray statements that nobody reads as eagerly as they read the accusations. There had been a security concern that morning. I'd felt it, hadn't I? I'd watched the men with the earpieces go from their slow walk to something tight and fast, and I'd seen the equerry lean into the Queen's window with his serious face, and I'd known, without knowing what, that something had gone wrong inside the machine. I just hadn't understood what it was. What it was, and I'm keeping this deliberately vague because the details were never fully made public and they're not mine to invent, was a warning. Something flagged that morning late after the cars were already in position. A concern about the route, about the timing, about sitting still at that gate for as long as the schedule had them sitting still. I don't know more than that, and anyone who tells you they do is guessing. But it was enough that the men whose entire job is to imagine the worst had decided the worst was a little too imaginable that day, and they had done what they're trained to do, which is, get the principle moving. Don't wait. A stopped car is the dangerous one. A moving car is safe. Go. That was the message the equerry carried to the Queen's window. We can't sit here. We need to move. Now. And the Queen, frightened, I think, properly frightened, in a way that had nothing to do with the cameras, made a fast decision in a bad moment, which is the only kind of decision a moment like that allows. She said, go. Get this car moving, get it through the gate, and the second car will follow with the girl in 30 seconds, and we'll all be moving, and we'll all be safe, and we'll sort the order out on the way. That was it. That was the whole monstrous cruelty. From inside her head it was love. Frightened, clumsy, badly shaped love. Get moving, all of us, the girl right behind me. From inside her fear, the second car was as good as the first. 30 seconds was nothing. Of course the girl understood. Of course she'd follow. She didn't know how it would look. That's the thing she didn't see, and the thing the guard saw, and the difference between them is the whole story. The Queen saw a security problem and a sensible solution. Tomas saw a young woman come out of a door, alone, and watch her family drive away from her in front of the world. The Queen was solving the wrong problem. She was so busy keeping the girl safe that she didn't notice she was, for one unbearable public minute, abandoning her. And the girl, already so thin that winter, already so sure underneath all that public love that she didn't really belong, that she was the outsider who'd married in and never quite measured up. The girl was never going to read, 30 seconds behind in the second car. The girl was only ever going to read, they left. And that is why, when the guard stopped the car, and the Queen turned in her seat and saw the princess's face, that ruined, abandoned, child-in-a-crowd face, she got out. She got out because she understood in that instant what she'd done. Not what she'd meant. What she'd done. The guard had forced the pause that let her see it. He'd held the moment still long enough for an old, frightened, careful woman to look up from the problem she was solving and see the person she was hurting. That's what the nod was. When she got out of the car and looked at him and gave him that tiny fraction of a nod before she ran to the steps, that was a woman saying thank you, and I see what you saw, and I'd have got it wrong forever if you hadn't stopped me. All in one movement too small to photograph. He didn't save the princess from the Queen. That was never it. He saved the Queen from a mistake she would have had to live with for the rest of her life. There's one more thing about the Queen, and I only put it together later, and when I did it changed how I think about her completely. She had been the outsider once. I told you right at the start that the public found her cold, that she wasn't the one they'd chosen to love. What I didn't know then What I learned later from an older member of staff who'd been there decades was that this hadn't always been her tragedy alone. When she was young, when she first married in, half a lifetime ago, she had been exactly what the princess was now. The newcomer, the one who didn't fit. The one the country looked at and decided, for reasons that had nothing to do with anything she'd done, that they didn't much care for. She'd spent her whole young life being the wrong one, the unloved one, the one they wished had been somebody else. And she had survived it by going hard, by building that weatherproof face, brick by brick, exactly the way I'd watched the princess build a smile out of nothing on the steps. She'd survived by deciding to stop needing them to love her. It had cost her the warmth people wanted from her, and they'd punished her for the coldness without ever knowing they'd made it. So when she ran across those cobbles and took the young woman's hands in both of hers and said whatever she said, I still don't know the words, and I've stopped wanting to, because some things should stay between two people. When she held the princess on those steps in front of the whole country, I don't think she was only comforting her daughter-in-law. I think she was holding the girl she used to be, the one nobody held. That's why the crowd cried, even though they didn't know any of that. People always feel the true thing even when they can't name it. They thought they were watching a reconciliation. They were watching something older than that. They were watching a woman make sure another woman didn't have to learn the lesson she'd learned the hard way, that you can survive being unloved by going cold, but that it isn't living, and that someone should have stopped the car for her once long ago, and no one ever did. Now, Tomas, because you'll want to know what happened to him, and it isn't simple, and I won't pretend it is. He was suspended. Of course he was. You can't step in front of the Queen's car, you can't leave the post, you can't break the one rule that holds the whole thing up and have nothing happen. There was an inquiry. There had to be. For a few weeks his future was genuinely uncertain, and the part of the country that had decided he was a hero made a tremendous noise about it. Petitions and banners and a great deal of shouting, and I don't think the shouting helped him at all, honestly. The men who decide these things don't like to be shouted at. It makes it harder for them to do the quiet, generous thing. But the quiet, generous thing got done anyway, and I'm fairly sure I know who did it. Because here is something that was never in any paper, that I only know because I was still working that gate, and you hear things at a gate. The inquiry was quietly, completely, settled in his favor. No charge. No disgrace. The official line was something bloodless about an officer acting in good faith under unusual circumstances. And the reason it landed that way, the reason the machine, which does not forgive broken rules, decided to forgive this one, was that two women had made it unmistakably clear that it would. The princess first. She'd asked to see him. That much did get out a little. She'd asked and she'd thanked him herself privately, and whatever she said to whoever needed to hear it, it carried weight, because she was the most loved person in the kingdom and everybody knew it. And the queen, the cold queen, the one the story had cast as the villain, she is the one, and I'd put money on this though I can't prove it, she is the one who made sure, behind every closed door that mattered, that not one hair on that guard's head was harmed. Because he'd done for her the thing no one had done for her when she was young. He'd stopped the car. And whatever else she was not a woman who forgot a debt like that. He kept his post. That's the part I love most and the part that surprised everyone. The country wanted him promoted, decorated, paraded. He didn't want any of it. He wanted his post. After the suspension, after the inquiry, after all of it, he went back to standing at the gate at Wexhill in the cold, the stone in the river, eyes forward, giving the tourists nothing, exactly as before. As if none of it had happened. As if the most extraordinary 90 seconds of his life had been a small interruption to the real work, which was standing still. I said at the very start that there was a piece of this I learned myself, by accident, in a corridor, months later from a man who didn't know I was listening. I'll give it to you now, and then I'll stop, because after this there isn't anything else and there shouldn't be. It was high summer by then. The flowers at the gate were long gone, the banners taken down, the clip mostly forgotten by a country that forgets quickly, the way countries do. I was inside the palace on some dull errand, paperwork, nothing, and I'd taken a back corridor I wasn't really meant to use, and two of the older guards were there off-duty, out of the coats, just men in shirt sleeves, talking the way men talk when they think no one's about. They were talking about Tomas. I shouldn't have stopped. I stopped. I stood very still against the wall the way you do, and I listened. And I'm not proud of it, but I'm not sorry either, because what I heard is the last piece, and it's the one that makes all the rest make sense. I didn't get the whole story, fragments, the way you do, but the shape of it was this. A long time ago, before the gate, before any of it, when he was a young soldier somewhere far from here, there had been a bad day. The worst kind. A crowd, a panic, an order to hold a line and keep moving and not break ranks no matter what. And on the wrong side of that line, in the crowd he was holding back, there had been someone, a young person. The fragment I caught was just the girl. And I never learned who she was, a civilian, a local, someone's daughter. I don't know, but she'd been on the wrong side reaching. And the order was hold the line, keep moving, don't break, and he had obeyed. He had been a good soldier. He had done exactly what he was told. He had stayed still and held the line and kept moving and not broken ranks. And she hadn't made it. That was all I heard. One of the older men said something low that I didn't catch, and the other said, "He's never gotten past it," and the first one said, "That's why he took the gate, to stand still. He thinks if he can just stand still long enough." And then a door opened somewhere and they stopped, and I slipped away down the corridor with my heart going hard, and I never heard the end of that sentence. But I didn't need the end of it. I'd already understood. He thinks if he can just stand still long enough, he can make it mean something. The obeying, the holding, the discipline that cost a life. He came to that gate to prove every single day in the cold that he could do the hard thing, the soldier's thing, the stay-at-your-post thing. He'd built his whole self out of standing still, the way the Queen had built hers out of going cold, both of them turning an old wound into a kind of armor. And then on a frozen morning he watched a young woman about to be left behind, watched a car start to pull away from someone who was reaching, alone, on the wrong side of a line. And the order, the unspoken order of the whole ritual, was the same order it had always been. Hold. Don't break. Let the car go. And this time, once, just once in his whole life, he broke. He ran, he stepped in front of the car. He did the thing he had not done all those years ago for the girl he couldn't save. He could not go back and save her. No one ever can. But he could refuse with his whole body to stand still and watch it happen to someone else. And so he did, and it cost him everything he thought he wanted, and he'd have paid it twice. The stillness and the running were the same thing. I told you that 2 parts ago before I understood why. They were both about the same girl. The years of standing still were grief. The 90 seconds of running were grief too. He just finally found something to do with it. That's the whole of it. That's everything I know and a little that I only feel. He's still there as far as I know. Still at the gate. Still giving the tourists nothing. Still the stillest of all of them, the stone in the river. People still come and stand at the fence and photograph the guards and never look at them properly. Never have the first idea what any of them are carrying behind those still faces, in those cold coats. At those posts they will not leave. I look now. Every time I pass a guard, anywhere I look. I can't help it. Because I know what I didn't know before that morning, that the stillest person in any place is usually the one holding the most, and that you never, ever know which of them is one small mercy away from stepping off the post and changing everything. People still ask me about that day. They want the simple version. The brave guard, the cruel queen, the rescued princess. And I used to try to correct them, and I've mostly given up, because the true version takes too long and asks too much and doesn't fit on a banner. But if they'll stand still long enough to hear it, I tell them this one thing. A guard's whole life is learning how to stay still. They train it into the bone. Stay at your post. Hold the line. Don't break, no matter what walks past you, no matter who. And he was the best of them at it, the very best for years and years and years. And then, for 90 seconds on a cold, bright morning, he was the best of them at the opposite. That's the part nobody puts on the banner. That's sometimes the bravest thing a man who has spent his whole life standing still can do, is move.